Hello, everyone. Welcome again. My name is Tim Ogden. I'm the Managing Director of the Financial Access Initiative at NYU Wagner. And welcome to today's 5 Live, part 2 of a conversation with Jesse McWaters, who is the Global Head of Regulatory Advocacy at MasterCard. And as much as one can call anyone these days an expert on this incredibly rapidly evolving domain of digital currencies, central bank digital currencies, cryptocurrencies, et cetera, and all things digital currency. If you're not aware, we had an initial conversation back in December on blockchain and what it is and how it works, as well as a lot of the other features that go along with understanding what's happening in the digital currency realm. You can get to those a recording and a transcript of that conversation with the links you see on the screen at the FAI YouTube channel or on the FAI blog. But at the end of more than an hour of conversation, there was a whole lot still left to talk about. And so we did a quick survey of everyone who participated to ask, would you want us to continue the conversation? And the overwhelming response was yes. And so that's why we're here today, is to continue that conversation. We are going to be building on and not just recapitulating what we did last time. So again, I'd encourage you to visit the transcripts or the video of the earlier session if there's some stuff that feels like we're 2 steps forward and you need some background information. Some housekeeping duties before we officially get started. Just a reminder to everyone, if this is the kind of thing that you're interested in, understanding the big ideas in financial inclusion and international development, how financial access and inclusion affects poverty, please do follow us. This is what we do all the time. Particularly one of the things that we're focused on right now is something called the Small Firm Diaries, which is a global project to understand the financial lives of firms of 1 to 20 employees. And there's going to be a lot coming out in that domain. We're also doing something called the Sentinel Project right now, trying to track the impact of the pandemic in real time on the evolution of the microfinance industry. And you can see updates about that and how various MFIs around the world are coping and how things are changing at financialaccess.org/Sentinel Project. Now, to today's topic, which is back to discussing the role of digital money in financial inclusion. I do want to say that this really is about answering questions and some other topics that came up in our last conversation. We've gathered some questions from the audience members last time that we weren't able to get to, some in the lead up to this this session, but also we want to do a whole lot of Q&A. So please do use the Q&A function to ask your questions, and we'll be moving through some of those questions throughout. You can also use the chat, but it's a little easier to manage Q&A. So if you can put those things there in the Q&A side of things, that would be really helpful to me. Okay, all of that out of the way, Jesse, let's come back to what's actually going on. And obviously it isn't just about the most recent news, but at the start of our conversation last time, I noted that I had some bona fides in this conversation. I went out and I bought some cryptocurrency in early November, 2020, this is 2021, this is 2022, and made a joke about I started the crypto slide, and it turns out I wasn't giving myself enough credit. I started a full-on crypto crash where the value of Bitcoin literally was cut in half since I bought a few little pieces of Bitcoin. And then there's been some other sort of headline stuff. We speculated last time there was some news about whether India might be banning cryptocurrencies. Shamika Ravi came on and said, I don't think that's going to happen, and much credit to her. She was exactly right. Since that last conversation, the Indian government has said, we're not going to ban cryptocurrencies. We're going to treat them like an asset. We're going to tax crypto transactions. So given that there have been some headlines in the last month, is there anything there that has really changed in the world of cryptocurrency that's really meaningful in sort of the broader scope of things?
Well, thanks so much, Tim, and thanks for having me back. Really, really excited to be part of this conversation. I'll kick off first by sort of, saying a disclaimer that I said last time, that this is going to be sort of my personal point of view on a lot of these matters. And I feel like I have to say that more with this particular issue than a lot of other issues in this space, because this is still very much a conversation that we're having within MasterCard, sort of, trying to figure out this rapidly evolving space and how to respond to it. But I think your question's a really important one. I guess what I would say is that we've always known that this is a very volatile space. Dips and rallies are nothing new. 50% declines and rapid rallies are absolutely par for the course for these sorts of assets, more so even than many others. But I think that's kind of a hallmark of new technologies and speculative assets overall. This is presumably driven by an expectation of tightening monetary conditions. And so when you raise interest rates at the Fed and in other central banks around the world, that raises the cost of money and of borrowing, which in turn makes accessing speculative capital more expensive. And so this can be sort of an experience of tapping the brakes, if you will, on speculation broadly. And there's perhaps no more speculative asset class than crypto. But ultimately, I think that if you believed in September that crypto assets were a transformative technology that had the potential to sort of drive enormous value in society, then I don't fundamentally think there's any reason that you should have changed your mind on that. And so I think that foundationally, this is a question of what's the appropriate price for this asset that's being raised at the moment, not a question of whether or not this asset is something that actually creates value. That's an ongoing discussion, but I don't think we learned anything new that triggered that crash over the past 3 or 4 months.
So one of the things we touched on really sort of in passing in the last conversation, but turns out to, I think, matter more, I wanted to return to, is the question of stable coins. So we did talk some about central bank digital currencies, and you did your job explaining there are a whole lot of factors. There's not such a thing as a central bank digital currency. It can be doing a lot of different things. But a lot of that sort of blends in with some of the idea of a stable coin, which is, in my understanding, it's basically crypto designed to not be quite so volatile, which is some of the appeal of a central bank digital currency too, is that it's not sort of subject to all sorts of internet craziness. There's actually a central authority governing it that can actually do things to maintain its stability. So Jesse, would you start with a description of what a stable coin is? And then let's talk about some of the differences between a stable coin and a central bank digital currency and where that matters.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about what a stable coin is, how they're used today, how people think they might be used in the future, and what that means for their difference between this and central bank digital currency. So a stable coin is really any type of token that exists on a blockchain that is designed to track the value of a reference asset. So that could be, in theory, any asset. In practice, it is most commonly the US dollar, but it could be gold, it could be the euro, it could be a barrel of oil. Now, how do you maintain that reference price? How do you make sure that your stablecoin token is always going to be worth, let's say, $1 US? Well, the simple way of doing that is that you simply, for every time somebody buys a stablecoin from you, they give you $1, you put that dollar into a bank account, and you can say, well, each one of these tokens is backed by $1, so you can come and claim it. Obviously, it should be worth $1. And when you think about it that way, it's really structured a lot like what in Europe you might call e-money, what here in the US you might call a stored value account or a prepaid card. Really kind of works a lot like those sort of products that we already know, and ultimately just with the value and the transactions being recorded on the blockchain. There are, of course, other ways of doing this as well, some of which are being explored, some pretty complicated decentralized systems that don't necessarily have that central actor around them. These are, at least in my view, inherently more volatile structures. They're getting used a lot in what's called the DeFi or decentralized finance space. But for the moment, let's just sort of think about them as these sort of stored value accounts. Now, what they're getting used for today is they're getting used as a bit of a wonky way of saying it, but as a settlement vehicle for facilitating crypto trading. So, you bought some Bitcoin. Imagine you wanted to, in a sort of relatively quick and relatively efficient way, liquidate your blockchain, your Bitcoin position, but you don't necessarily want to cash out yet. You think you might want to reinvest later on. You think it's going to dip again and come back up. You might have a whole bunch of reasons for this. The simplest way to do that would be to exchange your Bitcoin for one of the stable coins in the market. And you're sort of sitting on a relatively risk-free asset pegged to the US dollar, and then you could sort of re-enter it, right? So it's really this liquidity mechanism for capital markets. That's what the vast majority of stablecoin transactions today are used to facilitate. But when payment experts look at stablecoins, they say, well, there's some interesting stuff here. They settle instantly, which is another way of saying that they're very fast and potentially can be thought of as efficient in that regard. They have this property called programmability. So you can write what's called a smart contract and have the stablecoin move in a particular way in response to some external event. And really interestingly, they're interoperable with other tokens. So you and I can initiate a transaction in which we, say, swap some Ether that I'm holding for a stablecoin that you're holding, and we can have confidence that the transaction will only go through if both legs of the transaction are executed. So we look at that and say, there might be something here. We might really be able to build some interesting new payment networks on the back of that. And so we start to think about a world in which the future, these might actually get used for a variety of retail payments, peer-to-peer, person-to-merchant, all kinds of different stuff. Remains to be seen, but it's certainly possible. And so then you ask yourself, well, that sounds a lot like a central bank digital currency. What's the difference between them? And the answer is, as it always is in this space, that it depends. It depends on what features and functions the central bank digital currency has, and it depends on what kind of regulations and assurances a stablecoin has. Today, stablecoins in most jurisdictions are fairly loosely regulated. Some of them appear to be quite well run, with auditing around the reserves and all of that sort of stuff, really strong controls in place. Some of them maybe a little bit less so. Maybe you're not quite certain that that sort of account full of dollars that they say they have is actually there, and maybe then you're at risk of there being a run on that stablecoin. The general direction that we're seeing from a regulatory perspective is regulators saying, we want to hold stablecoins to the same level of expectation, the same level of security and consumer protection that we apply either to e-money or prepaid accounts or to deposits. And we just want people to be able to have a great deal of confidence in these things. And then when you find yourself in that sort of circumstance, you're like, well, okay, if those types of regulations are in place, I probably don't care that much whether the promise comes from the central bank or from a highly regulated and highly compliant financial institution. So the average person on the street probably looks and says, well, stablecoins, CBDCs, more or less equally valuable. And then you have to ask yourself the question of, if there's a CBDC and a stablecoin operating within your country, what are the functions and features around it? Has the CBDC been specifically designed to meet some financial inclusionary goals? Or perhaps does the stablecoin have built into it some types of programmability that are really useful for merchants that the central bank maybe didn't get around to or didn't want to sort of make the investment into developing into the CBDC? Which is all a really kind of dull way of saying that it depends, but that critical in this is individuals being able to have trust that the underlying infrastructure and the overall operation of the token that they're using is secure. And that is something that we are frankly in most jurisdictions still working on.
Jesse, I want to focus in on the smart contract idea here, because that's again something that is woven through a lot of these conversations that we haven't really talked about. And it strikes me in some mechanism that part of what's happening in the crypto and digital currency world is the financial system has been so sophisticated, it's developed for so long and is so sophisticated that it does a lot of things that people just take for granted, aren't aware are happening.
Yeah.
And so you reference the smart contract that says it only goes through if it, both sides of it happen. And in fact, that's not like unique, right? We have other systems that reverse, can start transactions and reverse them, and the checks to make sure that things happen. And we have enforcement mechanisms for fraud. And I hear a lot about smart contracts, but in some ways it seems to me like a smart contract is actually a dumb contract. It's a dumb contract in the sense that somebody's got to write down every possible thing in it, and it's only going to do that one thing. It cannot adjust at all. Whereas the contracts we have now are smart contracts because there's a human being there looking at it saying, well, it says this, but it very clearly what they meant is this thing. And so we're going to interpret it in line with not this really dumb, well, that's literally what the words say, so it can only be exactly that. So, when you look at things like smart contracts and how they fit into this, how much do you consider that a feature and how much a potential bug of a system?
So I think a friend of mine who's a sort of a bit of a pundit in the crypto space, Patrick Merck, I think puts this extraordinarily well. He says that the smart contracts are neither smart nor contracts. But at the same time, they're really interesting and cool, right? So the notion that you can use a programming language to natively create programmability around money is kind of a neat trick. But that's not the same as that contract being able to sort of solve every problem you have, right? A silver bullet that is able to accommodate all possible states of the world. And so, I'm always inclined to think about this a little bit, sort of drawing on some of the examples that we have from established securities law, with the disclaimer that I am not a lawyer. But in securities, we have this thing called ISDA, which is the International Standards for Derivatives Association, or something very like that. And basically, one of the things that they do is they create bog standard contracts for derivatives. Hey, like you want a basic call, a basic put, you want this, that. Here's the standard, right? Copy and paste this contract. You and I have maybe used this contract in other exchanges dozens of times before, so we'll use it. We kind of know how it works. Now, that's not to say that it's impossible for something to go off the rails at some point in this process. It's not to say that we won't at some point want to appeal to a higher authority to say, hey, we think this situation has happened outside of the contract. But it is to say that it can drive efficiency in the way that we are interacting on a commercial basis. And so I think that we can think about smart contracts in that same way. And I think we're still really exploring the use cases here, but there may be opportunities for us to deploy these sorts of systems in a way that drives efficiency and automation. My personal view is that we are likely to see those use cases first in the B2B space, things like trade finance, not necessarily in sort of retail use cases or particularly not in financial inclusionary use cases. But it's possible that we'll start to see these use cases develop. We'll start to see them trickle down. But my personal assessment is that we're always going to need a legal system or a scheme body that is in a position to, on an overarching basis, do dispute resolution. And this is something that we at MasterCard do within our own payment systems, right? When our issuers and acquirers don't agree on who should be responsible for, say, a fraudulent transaction, we manage a service according to a set of rules that helps to arbitrate those disputes. And we have 400 pages of rules on this subject, but there are still lots of cases in which there is a need for interpretation in order to resolve that dispute. And I think it's, personally, I think it's a little bit naive to imagine that you can program your way out of the need for some level of interpretation and oversight.
Again, I am something of a techno cynic, in part born from starting the first 10 years of my career in heavy duty technology spaces. And it's remarkable to me how anybody who has ever used software thinks that creating a bunch of rules and code is a better solution. That there's so many places that things can go wrong.
The way that I think about this is
language thing.
It's the core of the question to me should be, how do we maximize straight through processing? Not how do we eliminate the need for exception management, which is, I know, like, that is an incredibly nerdy way of putting it. And I'm sure that a whole bunch of our viewers have just sort of, their eyes have glazed over here. But it's to say, not how do you eliminate the need for governance, the need for oversight, but how do you make sure that it gets used as infrequently as possible? Because when you need to look at something closely, when you need to bring people in, when you need legal interpretations, a process gets slowed down and it becomes costly. And so the lens that I look at these technologies through is, how do we make sure that that happens as infrequently as possible, rather than how do we eliminate the need for that layer entirely?
Jesse, I want to latch onto that just quickly to make a different point from the world that we live in and think about all the time. Is, I think I'm really glad you said that. I probably don't give it enough credit as a techno cynic, but that piece of a rules-based infrastructure that eliminates the need for governance and intervention as much as possible, I think is a really underappreciated part of the microfinance revolution. That microfinance, part of the reason it succeeded is it goes into environments where all of the financial transactions of people who are traditionally excluded are have a lot of friction. It's always a negotiation. There are never any rules, and it's not clear who's in charge of the governance. And everything from the price of onions today to how much money you owe to your cousin who you borrowed from and when is a negotiation. And microfinance brings in a product that is very, very rigid. And often we think of that as a negative, but in a lot of senses, it can be a positive, because there's a set of very standard rules. So you don't have to negotiate everything. It reduces a lot of friction. The meeting is every week at this time, and the repayment is exactly this amount. And it's the same for everybody. And there isn't oh, well, now I can negotiate all of these sorts of changes and I'll pay you a little bit less this week. And it's structured. And so I don't want to underemphasize or undercut the importance of a system that extends that efficiency, that reduces friction, because there are these rules that are easy to inspect, potentially, not always, but easy to inspect, that allows for some efficiency. That does matter a lot when it comes to financial inclusion, where cost of transaction is a factor in who gets served.
Yeah.
So sorry, that's just a big diversion.
And I think, and I think ultimately, when you establish a good framework for these sorts of things, you are able to establish trust between parties that may never have seen each other, may never have interacted with one another. I mean, I think about this often within the case of cross-border transactions. I'd have to excuse me for sort of, giving a MasterCard example here, but, I could have a credit card and a debit card issued by a small bank in Kansas with, 4 branches. And I could go to a hotel in Kuala Lumpur for lunch. Folks at that hotel maybe have never heard of my bank, but because there's a network and a joint set of rules that both of those parties have signed on to, have used many, many times, have gone through the process of dispute resolution with, and have trust in, I don't need to bring traveler's checks with me or, have carried a bunch of cash and then changed it at the airport. I'm able to use sort of a single payment credential relatively seamlessly around the world. And I think that sort of interoperability really flows out of governance structures that folks are able to have faith in, whether they're fully centralized or partially decentralized. I think ultimately being more a question of efficiency than anything.
So I definitely want to come back on the trust issue and the varieties of ways that trust gets built and used or abused. But I want to take a moment to talk about one other thing in the world of crypto that we haven't really touched on yet that generates a lot of headlines. And I don't want to go necessarily deeply into NFTs, but yeah, it feels like we're leaving a big hole if we talk about all of these basic stuff about crypto and we don't address NFTs. And so I know this isn't necessarily your area of specialty, but given that you know more than I do, and probably most of the people on the call, just in general, I want to, one, give us your best simple definition of NFTs and what they are, but more importantly, does it matter for financial inclusion? I'm not saying it doesn't matter at all, but does it matter for financial inclusion? Do people in the financial inclusion space, can they just skip all headlines that use NFTs, or do they need to be paying attention?
Well, I think it's a pretty interesting space. So I wouldn't skip all the headlines. I think that NFTs are a really interesting concept, but one that is sort of clearly struggling in terms of its practical implementation and having a lot of the growing pains that we see in any early stage ecosystem. I think while we've seen this explosion of popular awareness and investment in NFTs that's relatively recent, they actually sort of first burst onto the scene back in 2017 with a project that I think is really interesting that was called CryptoKitties. So the initial concept behind CryptoKitties was basically that it was going to be a card trading game where rather than the cards being physical and issued by a central publisher, they would be tokens distributed based on a pre-programmed set of rules that were coded into the Ethereum blockchain. And so you could trade these crypto kitten, goofy looking little trading cards, amongst each other. And you could, according to a set of rules, you could breed them with one another to create new cards. And then I don't know exactly the details, but you could sort of play games with these cards. Now that particular project almost immediately ran into challenges due to the limited scalability of the Ethereum blockchain at the time. But at the core of it, you can see this really interesting idea forming. A user-defined community coming together to create new pieces of digital content with ownership rights that are jointly defined and that shape how you're able to use that asset within the community, right? And there's something kind of exciting here, right? Like a card game run by its users rather than by, an external centralized company that might have different incentives from your own. Now, we've seen promoters of NFT really kind of build on this idea. And they've highlighted the potential, for example, for NFTs to create new art markets, to perhaps better enfranchise creators. And those, I think, are really exciting concepts. But it's also pretty clear that the results to date have been mixed. Over the past month, I think we've been seeing a lot of troubling reporting about plagiarism. People saying, posting the Mona Lisa and saying, "Hey, this is a piece of art that I created. I'd like to sell it on this particular blockchain." That's obviously sort of a bit of an over-the-top example. People basically copying, pasting art that they didn't create and trying to sell it in these spaces, as well as something called wash trading, which is basically people handing tokens around between different accounts that they all control in order to create this sort of illusory upward increase in value. And I think ultimately, like, this is emblematic of a challenge that blockchains have, that like many other systems, they have a garbage in, garbage out problem. They're an exceptional means of keeping track of who owns what, but that only works if they're initially populated with information that's right. And so I think there are kind of two ways of thinking about this. One is specific to the NFT ecosystem. I think that we need to think about what solutions exist around how to keep me from uploading the Mona Lisa or any other sort of piece of art that I didn't create and saying that I created it, because we want the underlying creator of the asset to benefit. I think ultimately that requires there to be trusted parties that are able to provide control points in terms of the onboarding to these networks and in terms of monitoring the legitimacy of the transactions that are occurring within these networks. And I think that if you do that, there's really the potential here for some interesting things to happen. But I think more broadly than that, and to really get at the nub of your question about financial inclusion. NFTs today, as with most forms of crypto assets, are primarily, in my view, a speculative asset class. And a speculative asset class is an opportunity for people who have investable capital to maybe take a little bit of that, make an investment, and perhaps make a significant return on it. But that's no different than investing in an early stage oil well or an early stage biotech company. There are people who lose money and people who get rich every day making those sorts of bets. It's not a systemic set of changes designed to actually better enfranchise individuals who are today excluded. And I don't think that we can look at the notion of riding speculative assets to the moon, as they say in the crypto world, as being a solution to the very real problems that we have in society that result in people being financially excluded.
Thanks for that, Jesse. For audience members, I want to point to Tressie Cottom McMillan, writing in the New York Times, has been had a series of posts about crypto and folk economics in the United States that sort of touches on some of these things, this general idea that there are a lot of people from excluded communities who are being drawn into crypto. And why is that? And some of it comes down to this idea of distrust, but also that somebody somewhere is making money. It's just not me. And as you touched on, there's always danger in these innovations where fabulous fortunes are being created, that it draws in the people who are on the margins into things that are really risky and hard to understand. And there is some concern across the board in crypto of what this means for people, and are they going to be drawn into things they don't understand, and how that works. That being said, to me, one of the more interesting things and the potential in blockchain applications has something to do with NFTs, which is, in a lot of developing countries, there is this problem of verifiability, institutional reliability. So just as an example, how do I prove that I got this diploma, that I got this training? In an environment where it's hard, it's easy to forge things and easy to fake things, and identities aren't that certain. And so I thought, okay, similar to I'm going to buy some crypto before the last call, I thought, why don't we just do this thing for this version of the 5 Live to illustrate how you might be able to use blockchain, in some sense an NFT, to address this problem of how do I prove that I did something, or I had this experience, or I've received this training. And so I asked Ria Almeida from our team at FAI to create an NFT that was basically, I was being funny, it's a t-shirt, basically a picture of t-shirt that says, I attended the 5 Live and all I got was this lousy t-shirt NFT. And so I want to bring Ria in here to describe what happened when we tried to make an NFT that we could give to people who came to this 5 Live to prove that they had been at the 5 Live. So I'm going to promote Ria to a panelist here. And it tells me it failed to change that. So I'm going to just say allow to talk.
Sure. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now, Ria.
Great. Thanks, Tim. So yeah, we tried to list an NFT that we would be able to gift to every attendee of this webinar. So we had to start with creating a MetaMask wallet, which for non-crypto speakers is just like a regular online wallet, like where you store your cash. Here, it's where you store your crypto. Then we had to be able to trade it. So we had to create an OpenSea account, which gives you access to a crypto marketplace. So you can buy, sell, and gift on the marketplace. Then we attempted to list our NFT, and this is where the plan started to break down a little bit. The first problem we encountered in listing the NFT, which is just uploading it onto the marketplace, is that it has a very high and fluctuating gas fees. This gas fee started to range from $40 to $200 and was fluctuating based on the value of Ethereum at the time. So just for us to list it, even if we wanted to gift it for $0, list it for no money, we still had to pay the gas fees just to put it up there. Then the second problem was we said, okay, maybe we can circumvent this gas fees, which took us deep, deep into a Reddit thread, as these things do. And this Reddit thread told us to try to circumvent the gas fees by switching off the Ethereum network onto a Polygon network, which is just a cheaper network, and the gas fees is not that expensive. So we made this switch. It had to be made on the wallet as well as on the OpenSea account. This did make the transaction cheaper, but this feature was down on OpenSea at the time, so we couldn't transact. But let's say we could. Let's say we circumvented that problem. The gas fees was only $2 and we could trade. For us to be able to gift all of the, let's say, 100 attendees of this webinar, we would have to create 100 different NFTs, because the point of NFTs is that they're unique, they're one of a kind. Then we would need 100 different unique blockchain IDs of each of the 100 attendees' wallets. So every attendee would need to create a MetaMask wallet and give us their unique blockchain ID. And then we would have to transact each unique NFT to each unique blockchain wallet and pay an individual gas fees per transaction. So that's all to say that at the end of this year, each attendee is not going to get an NFT, because it was a very, very complicated, expensive, and confusing process.
Thanks for that, Ria, and apologies that I couldn't fully bring you in for Zoom technical reasons, but appreciate the work that you put into this and sort of describing it. And Jesse, for me, some of this lesson was the news, the headlines don't really tell us how complicated some of these things are, and that the people who are writing these stories are significantly more technically competent than the average person, even sort of who's running a Zoom webinar. And the gap that we see still between concept and application still seems vast.
Oh, I mean, what I'll tell you is that even my friends who are big time crypto boosters, most of them will acknowledge that the user experience in this space is still iffy at best. And you see a lot of work being done to try and figure out how to address that. And so, I mean, I think that there are questions that I think are still in place around the scalability of these networks, around whether or not they ultimately have unique customer value propositions. But I actually think that the type of operational challenges that you've talked about here are the sorts of things that we see getting sort of smoothed out over time, if there is in fact a genuine sort of strong use case and strong customer value proposition. I think that the challenge is building that more underlying sustainable network that is actually able to provide trust, and that is able to ensure that the NFTs that are being created are genuine, if you will, in terms of they have actually been placed there by the artist. And then there's a lot of complexity in this space when you start to think about it. You moved that NFT between the Polygon chain and the Ethereum chain. And what happens when you have an NFT on there's the same, underlying sort of piece of intellectual property attributed to different people on multiple different chains? There is no in-chain mechanism for reconciling that. And I think it just serves to underline the fact that you continue to need some form of overarching frameworks, and you need control points in terms of network entry and exit, to really be able to have faith in these systems over the long term.
So there's a question from longtime FAI friend Martha Bowen, who works at the Millennium Challenge Corporation. I'm not going to ask Martha's question for her. I'm going to attempt to see if the technology works this time to promote Martha to a panelist. Nope, it's just not going to let me do it. So Martha, I'm just going to allow you to talk and let you ask your question, Martha. But I also wanted to bring you in specifically because I know you think a lot about the evolution and the development of Indonesia, which is an area of a whole lot of digital foment. And so also, please go ahead and ask the question, because it sort of takes us towards some actual applications that I think a lot of people speculate about. But also, interested in your thoughts on, what's happening in Indonesia and thinking about the possible role of crypto and digital currencies in a place like Indonesia. Martha, yeah, you're there.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you so much. And that's okay. I don't need to be a panelist to make others listen to the sound of my voice. So you're right. We are thinking a lot about Indonesia over here at MCC in terms of financial intermediation in general, and then how that impacts specifically on investment in Indonesia, both sort of large scale, large infrastructure investments, but also small scale. So there is this movement within Indonesia today, of course, to help micro, small and medium-sized enterprises, not all of which are small. I mean, we need to remember that micro enterprises in Indonesia have up to $70,000 worth of assets. That's how they're measured. How they can get better at exporting, of course, is the priority of the Indonesian government. And so issues around foreign exchange and how foreign currency is dealt with are, have always been part of the Indonesian story. And certainly when we look at the balkanization of how foreign exchange has been managed in Indonesia according to specific commodities, there's a long story to tell there. But I think as we look at crypto, the Indonesian government, like many others, is really trying to catch up in terms of their regulatory posture around it. And they've generally been fairly good about allowing these sandboxes for crypto and fintech and other sort of newer technologies to emerge. But I am wondering that the conversation about stablecoin at the beginning of this call really made me wonder about whether investing in some of these, or since then you've described them as these alternative asset classes, if they can be seen as a way to hedge against traditional currency risks or foreign exchange risks in particular. I recognize that this is moving even further away from the financial inclusion thrust that you were going for, but that idea of somehow trying to buy down risk in cross-border transactions, I think, is a very relevant one for Indonesia at the moment, and certainly something we're interested in. So thank you for letting me ask the question.
Thanks, Martha.
That's interesting, Martha. That's not quite the question that I thought you were going to ask. So I guess I'll say two things. One is that, broadly speaking, in the crypto asset space, we have seen an evolution of narratives about the types of use cases that these assets sort of provide. And one of the stories that has at times been used, particularly around Bitcoin, is that it is a non-correlated asset that can be used as a hedge against sort of other economies or against sort of other currencies. I think the jury is still out on that, and I think it's more doubtful than it's been in the past. We've seen sort of recently, overall crypto asset prices becoming fairly highly correlated with sort of prices of other speculative assets, including traditional equities. And so that sort of notion of it being non-correlated and providing a hedge, I think, less central to thinking now. But it is frequently being thought about and frequently being discussed within the context of moving money cross-border. And I think there's a relevant piece here from a financial inclusion perspective, because I think that it would be fair to say that there are a lot of people out there for whom the remittance experience really sucks. It's slow, it's expensive, the fees aren't always transparent, and you as the sender and as the recipient don't always know when the money will arrive. And I think you've heard and seen a lot of people who have been holding up stablecoins and other types of assets as being a silver bullet to this problem. And I think I take a bit more of a middle of the road view here, in that I think that they have the potential to be part of a broader solution. And I'll just talk for a minute about sort of, and I think you've highlighted a key point here, but it's that the problems that are facing cross-border payments today are about more than just technology. There's an ongoing sort of piece of work on this led by the G20 cross-border payments roadmap. They've identified a total of 19 building blocks that they think need to be worked on. And when you go through that document, it becomes clear that technology is part of those. Indeed, stablecoins is one of those building blocks, thinking about how to make sure that they're trusted. But you start to really clearly see that the challenges around cross-border payments are much bigger than just technology. And that if there's a single word that I could put to the challenges that we face there, it's alignment. Alignment on messaging standards, alignment on anti-money laundering regulations and enforcement requirements, alignment of the APIs that connect the various pieces of these systems, on the data transfer frameworks that allow AML and other forms of data to move or not move out of the country, and as you alluded to, currency controls, all of which really add to the complexity of addressing cross-border payment problems, and clearly require a high level of public-private cooperation. And so one of the things that I always sort of like to stress when I can in forums like this is the importance of not assuming that technology can fix all these problems. I mean, we can build new infrastructure that runs 24/7, that moves faster. You know, to pick up on something we talked about earlier, we can push through higher straight-through processing rates, really reduce the frequency of the need for manual exception handling. We can build better digital ID frameworks that make transactions more trusted and secure. But we need to be careful about any solution whose effectiveness is predicated on the idea that if everyone just used this one system, then we would be able to live in a simpler place. Because when you approach that problem that way, you tend to abstract away the costs of alignment. And so if everyone used one stablecoin on the same network and used it to pay for all of their expenses, then obviously, remittance would be a simple thing. There wouldn't even be foreign exchange because everyone would use the same asset, maybe a USD denominated stablecoin. But that's not a very likely world. And it's not one that a lot of governments in the world would necessarily want, because they would be giving away really important parts of their sovereignty and their ability to control monetary policy within their environment. And so I think when you get to the boundaries of these systems, and in particular in financial inclusion use cases, where you start to say, oh, well, the end recipient may not be banked, and thus you need to move to a cash out system, the agent networks around that, you end up adding in a lot of the same complexity that we see even with the sort of more technologically antiquated networks that sometimes are enabling cross-border payments today. So I don't know that I've quite answered your question, but I think just a few sort of relevant things to think about when we approach the kind of the cross-border narrative more broadly.
And I want to follow up on that, Jesse, too. And all of this, seems like everything is always so complicated. There's so many different threads. But again,
if it was easy, it would already be solved.
Right. And we'll post links to this, by the way. But there's this fabulous description from Matt Levine at Bloomberg of a thing that has happened in the headline since the last time we talked, is that this couple in the United States was arrested for apparently, it hasn't been proven, but apparently stealing $4 billion worth of Bitcoin back in 2016. And the really remarkable thing about this story is that in all of that time, they'd actually managed to launder and extract less than probably 200 million of that, because it was so incredibly complicated for them to go from this stolen Bitcoin through various networks to try to avoid detection, to turn it into money they could actually spend. And in the process, there's this gem of this thing, is that they had to create so many wallets, they lost track of their private keys to use the wallet. So they had to create a spreadsheet to keep track of their keys. And they kept that spreadsheet at Amazon Web Services, which responded to a subpoena. So the government got their spreadsheet that has all of their passwords, which is how the government was able to seize this $4 billion. And it's, the exact opposite. Like, it was so much of we hear, like, crypto is all about money laundering. It turns out crypto is terrible at money laundering if you actually want to ever get it back into dollars.
Yeah, so I think
there's to the central bank digital currency question, these cross-border flows, because as you were talking about, standardization matters, drives down costs, but lots of governments are uncomfortable with that. That's also, I think, an under-discussed part of the concern for central governments in creating a central bank digital currency is that it potentially gives them control, but it potentially loses control. And potentially it's a form of economic warfare against your neighbors. If Kenya's central bank currency becomes de facto in Tanzania, that creates a lot of problems in relationships between Kenya and Tanzania.
Yeah, and I think critically there, I mean, the notion of warfare is a sort of a provocative term. I think what's actually more concerning is that you could unintentionally harm your neighbor if other people start adopting your currency. And that's economists call this a problem of spillover effect. And there's actually a lot of thinking being done in terms of CBDC design about how to ensure that this doesn't happen. And as you can imagine, it's particularly concerning around the potential development of a US dollar. And the Fed and Treasury are thinking very much about how not to have a potential digital dollar have those sort of spillover effects. In the case of the Bitfinex hack, it's interesting. Some of my colleagues actually previously worked closely with the government on that case. Interestingly, from what I've been told, it's quite unlikely that that these two very interesting characters, who I think, just the rap career and all of this other stuff has really made this such an entertaining story. It's unlikely that they are actually the ones that stole these assets, but they have been involved in trying to launder them, and I think have provided a great object lesson of one of the inherent values of blockchain-based systems is that they provide exceptional traceability. I think the critical thing to remember, though, is that traceability in and of itself is not enough. You need to be able to have access to controls at the endpoint, and you need to have the tools in place to be able to be effectively and on an ongoing basis monitoring these sorts of issues so that they get tracked down. In a sense, this was an extraordinarily high profile case. And so, to use an analogy that I talked about earlier, it was a little bit like stealing the Mona Lisa, right? When you steal this much Bitcoin, it generates a lot of attention. The addresses that you've moved it to end up being watched. It's a subject of ongoing monitoring. I think what we need to work towards is a world in which if a much smaller denomination of assets are stolen, maybe $5,000 or $6,000, how do you make sure that those types of thefts are also going to be sort of properly tracked, and that you're not going to have the ability to launder at that small scale? But I do think that critically, it's one of the more exciting things that we've seen in this space recently. It's just like, hey, there's actually a suite of new tools for both law enforcement and for financial institutions that want to ensure that their networks don't become a haven for money laundering. And I think that's quite exciting.
So one of the common questions that we got through our channels comes back to some of these trust issues, particularly for people at the margins. I'm going to go out on a flyer here. Tamara Cook from FSD Kenya is apparently here. And Tamara, if you'll forgive me, I'm going to click allow to talk to potentially bring you into this, just sort of unexpectedly. James Ogata from the Busara Center was one of the people who asked this question. I was going to bring him in, but it looks like he just got disconnected. But Kenya remains something of an outlier. It's not utterly unique, but something of an outlier in this. Somehow people really latched on to this brand new thing with mobile money, with M-Pesa, and is probably instructive in some way. And then we've, this question of Kenya and the potentially exploring a central bank digital currency. So, Tamara, if you're there, if you're willing, I'd love to hear how you and FSDK are starting to think about what is it that Kenya learned in the building trust and consumer protection with M-Pesa. How does that potential apply to crypto and other digital currencies?
Thanks. Can you hear me?
We can.
Yeah.
Great. So that's a big question. And I think if I reflect on even the conversation we've had, a big part of it is use case. Most people who are familiar with the story of M-Pesa will know that the initial use case was send money home. It worked really well for that. It was way better than the alternatives. And so I think as we think about these kinds of currencies and the potential central bank digital currency, how is it way better than the alternatives, easy to use, easy to understand, and cost effective? And so I think that could be part of it. You'll have seen, you've already mentioned the central bank digital currency discussion paper was released by the central bank last week, and the new national payment system strategy will be launched by Central Bank of Kenya on Wednesday. So stay tuned for, I think, exciting things coming from Kenya. Did that answer your question, Tim?
It's really useful. I did see that this paper has come out. Haven't had a chance to look at it yet. I'll also note that again, we'll post links. The IMF just released what appears to be a very good and thorough report about the state of central bank digital currencies, and sort of breaks down what different people are thinking and why. And so, yes. Although Tamara, I'd like to sort of narrow in on the specific thing of how much of a factor do you think in the rapid M-Pesa adoption was not just it was much better, but it was delivered by a known entity that people already had lots of experience of. If they say they're going to do it, they're going to do it. It works.
I think that is an important factor. Although Safaricom didn't quite have the same market penetration when M-Pesa first launched as it does now. So it's important to remember that. But I do think I trust this company to make my calls connect, and therefore I'm going to trust this company to make money move. I think is an important factor. And so, but I believe what really made it work is I tried it and it worked, or I saw somebody else try it, they told me it worked. I think that's the most important thing.
Great, thank you for that. Jesse, turning to other questions, and again, thank you very much, Tamara, for letting me put you on the spot with no warning whatsoever on that. Jesse, another one of these questions is, as Tamara was saying, it's much better at doing something, in the explanation for M-Pesa. Tying some of these things together in cross-border payments and building up, are you aware of places where the transition from crypto to legacy currencies outside of a developed country, so in a developing country, where people are able to relatively easily transfer from crypto back to a legacy currency, which is a pretty important part of any step that you're evolving, whatever the payment system is. You need to be able to, anytime in the near future, be able to get out of the blockchain. Yeah. Are you aware of anywhere where that's working right now?
So I would expect that there are markets where that is the case. In most cases, there are probably fees associated with the cash in and the cash out side of that transaction, though not necessarily. But I'm not deep enough in the weeds to be able to point to specific examples of sort of operational excellence there. But I think it's certainly, there's no reason that you shouldn't be able to do that, though in some cases, the transaction costs associated with blockchain-based transactions can be quite high. And that may make certainly flitting back and forth between the two assets sort of, quite complicated. I mean, you alluded to the gas fees for Ethereum, wherein a transaction, depending on the time, depending on the urgency, can cost between $30 and $150. That's quite a substantial per transaction cost. Obviously, work being done on trying to figure out ways of pushing those fees down, but you're always going to have to figure out some way to pay for those. And so that's inherently going to be a challenge in terms of getting real sort of frictionless fungibility between traditional fiat currencies and these new crypto assets.
So we're at the hour. We always try to sort of wrap these things up. There is one highly speculative question here that we got in that I want to acknowledge and give a chance, but recognizing for everybody, this is highly speculative, not Jesse's necessarily role area of specific expertise. But to paraphrase the question we got in, Jesse, one of the challenges overall in global development and excluded communities is how do those communities get paid for their own knowledge, their abilities, the unique things about them, and specifically as an example. So knowledge of how to do traditional crafts or something that people actually, in fact, highly value in today's day and age, but it's excessively easy essentially to steal that knowledge so that the communities who invented the knowledge don't ever benefit from it. So there's a speculative idea that something like NFTs could provide an easier way for conscious consumerism. Mm-hmm. I want to make sure that when I buy this thing that is the result of generations of knowledge from an indigenous community, that indigenous community benefits. And so somehow NFT blockchain can enable making sure that the original creators, which is some of the idea of NFTs as well, the original creators actually benefit from the commercial transaction. Does that seem to make sense to you? Does that seem like something that is possible?
So I think it's an ambitious and an exciting idea. And I certainly don't want to dismiss it out of hand. But I look at that challenge and I think that fundamentally what you're talking about is a challenge of certification. How do you certify that this asset has a particular set of properties that are relevant if you're engaging in a sort of a constant, in this sort of conscious consumer concept? And I think that it is possible to deploy a certification body that is both centralized. We have lots of examples of that. I think, I'm not an expert in it, but I think fair trade coffee would perhaps be a good example of this, where we have a number of sort of widely trusted certification bodies that have specific definitions of what is fair trade, et cetera, et cetera. Or we could imagine using NFTs a decentralized certification body forming. My inclination is that creating a decentralized certification body is more difficult and more complex, which is to say, not that it couldn't happen, not that NFTs couldn't be useful against this particular use case, but I don't know that it actually succeeds in making the problem more tractable, easier to solve. And so might a centralized certification body leverage aspects of blockchain technology in order to demonstrate the traceability to sort of the original community that created the handicraft of the art? Potentially. Might that certification body actually be created by the community and be decentralized? Also possibly the case, but attesting ownership, sort of figuring out how to organize that decentralized certification body, inherently, I think, more difficult and more complicated. And so again, I'll say, not wanting to throw cold water on the idea, not wanting to say that it's not a thing worth exploring and trying, only wanting to say that I think it sounds difficult, and that we should be careful not to underestimate the complexity associated with setting that sort of system up.
Well, it's a useful thing. Jesse, I want to thank you again for taking the time. I think this has been tremendously useful. I hope for our audience it's also been useful. I've learned a lot, as I did in the last conversation and thinking about this. I'm going to take my prerogative as host to close this out with a final thought before thanking everybody for their attendance. And I think one of the challenges we have in this space is one of language. And the language, by and large, doesn't mean at all what the language we use is. So I saw something this week, or maybe last week, where someone was saying the best way to think about a smart device is to replace the word smart with surveillance. And I think that applies in this space. So, we're talking about smart contracts. Replace smart with dumb. Replace smart with surveillance. Replace decentralized, in many cases, with opaque decision makers as opposed to clear decision makers. And so as we continue to think about crypto and digital currency, I think a big part for all of us is remembering that just because somebody has decided to use this word to describe it does not mean that's actually what's going on. And you have to sort of look past the language and think about what is the appropriate language to think about these applications, and not just sort of assume that because someone's come up with a clever way of talking about it, that underneath that is actually what you think that word means.
If I can add one more thing to that, Tim, I think what you're getting at some level is that technology is just a tool. Tools aren't inherently good or bad. They're the product of the government's mechanisms that we put around them to have them used for good or for ill. And that's why I think the language we use and the way that we talk about these things, but also the way in which we govern the use of them, is ultimately so important for whether they produce net social benefit or net social ills.
Thank you for that. Thanks again to everyone for attending. We're going to wrap up. A quick commercial is that we are going to have 5 lives coming up in each of the next few months. In April, we'll be talking about financial and digital literacy. We'll be doing some things on platform work, and a 5 live on research on small firms that CGAP and CFI and FAI have been conducting. So we'll look forward to seeing all of you again, back to more traditional financial inclusion topics, but we'll continue to keep an eye on this. Please do watch the FAI site for summaries and links to the videos of this, so you can share it with your friends and show them that you know more about crypto than they do. In any case, thanks again, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again soon. Take care.